The room was a vault of power and whispers. Every surface gleamed, brass nameplates, polished wood, microphones poised like weapons. Outside, the press waited, their headlines already drafted. $15K bribe to muzzle outspoken representative? Inside, you could almost hear the hum of money moving through invisible hands. Then came the silence, sharp, deliberate, almost theatrical. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless at the center of it, her gaze steady, her hands folded like she'd been here 1,000 times before. Her opponents leaned back, confident. They'd played this game for decades, by silence, package compliance, sell it as diplomacy. But Jasmine didn't come to play. One of them coughed, shuffled papers, muttered something about decorum. Another smiled that politician's smile, the kind that hides a blade behind every word. Then, softly, the line dropped like a trapdoor opening. "We've made arrangements. 15,000 should smooth things over." 15,000. The number hung in the air, small enough to be insulting, big enough to reek of arrogance. A few glances darted around the table. Someone tried to move on, pretend it hadn't been said. But Jasmine wasn't built for pretending. She leaned forward, the faintest smirk tugging at her mouth. Her voice was calm, not loud, not rushed, just steady enough to make everyone stop breathing. "If you think $15,000 can shut me up," she said, "you clearly don't know who you're dealing with." The hum of the microphones picked up her words like thunder rolling through marble. A chair creaked. Someone's pen froze mid-note. In that instant, the hierarchy inverted. Money no longer had gravity. Dignity did. The arrogance that filled the room began to crumble, inch by inch, under the weight of her calm. Reporters outside sensed a shift. Phones buzzed, whispers multiplied. The story they'd expected just turned into something much bigger. Because in a world where silence is currency, Jasmine Crockett had just declared bankruptcy on fear itself. But what Jasmine said next would ignite a firestorm that no amount of money could contain. Washington wears its hypocrisy like a badge of honor. Polished marble, rehearsed smiles, and corridors echoing with deals whisper behind half-closed doors. Inside the committee chamber, where truth is supposed to breathe, the air is thin with compromise. Everyone knows the rule. Survive by staying quiet. Thrive by staying bought. This was the culture Jasmine Crockett had walked straight into, and from the moment she opened her mouth, the room knew she didn't belong to their club. Around her, the establishment hummed with quiet calculation. Suits shuffled papers, aides leaned in, and every expression seemed to say the same thing. Don't make noise, don't make enemies, and maybe you'll last long enough to matter. But Jasmine didn't come to last. She came to matter. Behind the scenes, the donors had been restless. Lobbyists with manicured hands and polite smiles were making calls that carried more weight than votes. A $15,000 arrangement wasn't random. It was a message, a test to see if this new voice from Texas could be folded neatly into the system. The men who orchestrated it weren't villains in the cinematic sense. They were worse, the kind who believed corruption was just how things worked. They dressed their greed in civility, their power plays in policy talk. "You'll learn," one of them once told a junior member, "that silence is strategy." They built careers on that philosophy, shaping laws, protecting wealth, polishing legacies. They mistook politeness for morality, thinking decency was measured in donations. So when Jasmine rejected the offer, it wasn't just defiance, it was disruption. She had cracked the social contract of Washington, that unspoken promise to nod, smile, and look away. Her refusal didn't just embarrass a man or a committee, it threatened an entire hierarchy. Behind closed doors, the panic began. Emails flew. Statements were drafted, then redrafted. One aide whispered, "She's going to make this public." Another replied, "She doesn't have to." The look on her face already did. Outside, the media sensed something brewing. Journalists started connecting dots, tracing campaign money trails, and one name kept surfacing, a familiar donor whose influence ran deep into both parties. Viewers couldn't believe who was really behind the $15,000 offer. It wasn't some obscure figure. It was someone whose handshake could change legislation. And that revelation? It wasn't just political gossip. It was gasoline on a spark. The whispers grew louder, questioned sharper. Why would so much effort go into silencing one woman from Dallas? What truth was she protecting that scared them so much? Every camera, every headline, every whispered doubt turned toward her, waiting for the next move. The system had miscalculated. They'd assumed fear would keep her quiet. Instead, they gave her a stage. In that tension, the story stopped being about one representative. It became about everyone who'd ever been told to lower their voice, to wait their turn, to play by the rules that protect the powerful. Jasmine was no longer just defending herself. She was holding up a mirror to a nation that had grown comfortable with silence. But to understand why she refused, why she met that offer with fire instead of fear, we need to go back to where her fire was forged. They came from the same world that built Washington's marble facades, a generation of men who believed the system was theirs because their fathers had written the rules. Their names floated through donor lists and dinner galas, stamped on the plaques of think tanks that claimed to defend democracy while selling access to it. They wore their lineage like armor, their confidence measured in campaign checks, their smiles rehearsed in the mirror of privilege. To them, politics wasn't service. It was inheritance. The ringleader of the silence attempt was a senator with a grin that had charmed donors for decades and a handshake that sealed more backroom deals than any law ever could. He believed in hierarchy the way others believed in gravity. Some people rose, most stayed grounded. His allies, a cluster of gray suits orbiting him like moons, shared the same vocabulary of power. They spoke in half-sentences, gestures, and the unspoken understanding that money was a language everyone eventually learned. They didn't see Jasmine Crockett as a threat. They saw her as a novelty, a burst of color in their monochrome universe, the kind of freshman congresswoman who would eventually realize how things work around here. When she spoke about justice, they nodded politely. When she challenged the establishment, they smirked. And when she refused to play their game, they whispered. "She'll come around," one of them said, swirling a glass of bourbon at a donor event. They all do. Washington has a way of sanding down the edges. But Jasmine's edges didn't dull, they cut. That's when the condescension sharpened. Suddenly, she wasn't passionate. She was angry. She wasn't principled. She was divisive. They called it professionalism. She called it what it was: prejudice dressed in etiquette. The arrogance wasn't just personal. It was systemic. These were men who could quote Martin Luther King Jr. at breakfast and vote against equality at noon. Their hypocrisy was an institution. They wrote checks to civil rights museums while lobbying against voting protections. They preached ethics from podiums, then traded influence over steak dinners. Their committees investigated corruption abroad, but ignored it in their own ranks. Each act of self-congratulation added another layer to machinery of arrogance that had kept people like Jasmine on the margin for generations. They didn't think of it as corruption. They called it stability. And stability, to them, meant control. The $15,000 wasn't random. It was routine. The same quiet offers had been made countless times before, just larger numbers attached to quieter souls. The only thing unusual this time was that Jasmine didn't flinch, and that shook them, because they had built entire careers on the assumption that everyone has a price. Behind closed doors, panic turned to disdain. "She's emotional," one advisor sneered. "She'll burn herself out." But the senator who orchestrated it all wasn't as confident as he sounded. He could feel the shifting energy, something dangerous, unpredictable, and unbought. To reassert dominance, he summoned his usual weapons: decorum, reputation, and selective outrage. His team released statements about respecting process, while leaks whispered that Jasmine had misinterpreted the offer. It was gaslighting on a national scale, designed to make truth sound hysterical and power sound calm. And for a moment, it almost worked. The headlines softened. Pundits debated tone instead of ethics. The machine spun back into rhythm, smug, self-assured, mechanical. But arrogance is a lazy god. It forgets the people it underestimates. As they toasted their own cleverness, Jasmine was preparing something they didn't account for. Not just a rebuttal, but a reckoning. While they counted their dollars, they forgot to count on one thing: Jasmine's history of fighting back. Jasmine Crockett didn't grow up around marble floors or manicured gardens. Her world was red dirt, Texas heat, and the hum of struggle woven into every conversation around the dinner table. Her mother worked shifts that blurred together. Her father fought to keep the lights on. And through it all, young Jasmine listened not just to what was said, but to what was silenced. When her neighbors were denied loans they qualified for, when her classmates were treated like statistics instead of students, she learned early that fairness was not the default. It was something you had to fight for. She wasn't born with connections or a family name that opened doors. What she had was defiance, the quiet, steady kind that refuses to fade. In school, teachers told her to tone it down, to pick battles carefully. But Jasmine's instinct was never to choose easy fights. Her essays were sharp, her debates relentless, her questions inconvenient. Why does justice only work for some people? She asked a civics teacher once. He sighed and said, "That's just how the world works." She smiled even then and said, "Then I'll change the world." Law school came with its own bruises. Professors who mistook confidence for arrogance, classmates who spoke over her in seminars, recruiters who couldn't picture a black woman leading a firm. Every door that shut only strengthened her resolve. She started representing people others ignored. Tenants bullied by landlords, workers cheated out of pay, victims dismissed because they weren't important enough. Her office was small, her resources thinner than the paper she filed. But her voice filled every courtroom. The first time she won a case against a well-funded corporation, the opposing lawyer smirked and said, "You got lucky." Jasmine didn't flinch. "No," she replied, "I got justice." It became a mantra she carried into every fight after that. Justice wasn't luck. Justice was earned by those brave enough to confront power without apology. She saw up close how the system rewarded the polite and punished the loud. Clients would whisper their gratitude after verdicts, saying things like, "You're the first one who listened." That stayed with her. Listening, she realized, was revolutionary when the world had decided whose voices mattered. When she entered politics, she didn't come with a consultant's polish or a millionaire's Rolodex. She came with stories of women working double shifts, of men wrongfully jailed, of families evicted in silence. On the campaign trail, she didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like someone who'd lived the consequences of bad policy. The people felt it. The establishment hated it. And yet, the higher she climbed, the more the whispers followed. Too emotional, too bold, too loud. They said she needed to soften her image, to learn diplomacy. Diplomacy, she discovered, was just another word for surrender when spoken by people who never had to fight for survival. Each insult only deepened her fire. She wore the labels like medals, proof that she hadn't traded her authenticity for acceptance. Every time she walked into a room where she wasn't expected to belong, she remembered the faces of the people who put her there. The single mothers, the renters, the dreamers. They were her armor. Still, the toll was real. Late nights blurred into dawns. The loneliness of being the only one in so many rooms left invisible scars. She'd hang up after tense calls, take a deep breath, and remind herself, justice isn't for sale. It was a sentence that steadied her heartbeat when everything else tried to shake it. The sexism, the racism, the dismissal, they weren't obstacles. They were training. Each attempt to silence her became proof that her voice was needed. Each sneer from a donor or a pundit reminded her that courage makes cowards uncomfortable. So by the time the $15,000 offer slid across the table, cloaked in civility, delivered with that same patronizing smile she'd seen all her life, it didn't surprise her. She had met that kind of arrogance before in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in back rooms where men decided what justice was worth. But this time, the stakes were national. The cameras were rolling. The same institutions that had tried to define her were now daring her to betray everything she stood for. And in that instant, all those years of struggle crystallized into clarity. She thought of her parents, of her clients, of every little girl watching, learning what resistance looks like. Her pulse slowed, her breath evened out, and she smiled, that same defiant, steady smile she'd worn since the first time someone told her to be realistic. So when the offer came, she didn't hesitate. But she didn't just say no, she made history. The hearing room was a stage dressed as democracy, flags perfectly framed, microphones gleaming under the fluorescent buzz. Every seat was filled, but the silence was the loudest thing there. The chairman cleared his throat, that habitual sound of control, and looked straight at Jasmine Crockett. Cameras were rolling. The audience could feel something about to break. He began with the careful language of Washington, the kind that turns manipulation into melody. "Congresswoman," he said, "I'd like to remind you the generous support your office has recently received from a certain donor community." The words were soft, almost flattering, but every syllable carried the weight of a warning. Jasmine didn't blink. The man adjusted his glasses, waiting for her to fill the silence with gratitude, apology, anything that would restore the unspoken order. Around him, a few members shifted in their seats, glancing at each other with that familiar look. She'll fold? They always fold. But she didn't. She leaned forward instead. Her voice came out calm, deliberate, carrying the steadiness of someone who'd already survived worse. "You can't put a price tag on the truth." The air snapped, the kind of pause that feels like the whole world inhaling at once. Somewhere, a pen dropped. A staffer froze mid-note. Then came the murmurs, low at first, spreading like an electrical current through the room. Some smirked, others frowned, but no one looked away. On the front row, a young reporter's fingers flew across her phone. A tweet hit the internet before Jasmine even finished her sentence. The chairman tried to recover, forced a chuckle, and said, "Let's maintain professionalism here." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Jasmine didn't raise her tone, didn't grandstand. She simply looked around the table, letting her eyes linger on each face long enough for discomfort to settle in. "Professionalism," she said softly, "isn't silence. It's accountability." The room shifted again. The people who had come expecting another routine exchange were now leaning in, realizing they were witnessing something different, a live dissection of power's arrogance. The official's confidence began to waver. He shuffled his papers, pretending to search for something that wasn't there. Every camera captured it, the subtle unraveling of authority. The light hit his forehead just so. Catching the sweat, he didn't have time to wipe away. Jasmine sat back in her chair, not gloating, not smiling, just steady, the kind of composure that made her look untouchable. "You can remind me of donors all you want," she said, "but the people who sent me here can't afford lobbyists. They only have my voice, and I'm not selling it." That line hit like a verdict. Reporters outside turned toward the screen, anchors interrupting segments mid-broadcast. One commentator said, "I think we just saw the moment power blinked." Inside the room, the tension was almost visible, a fog of disbelief hanging over polished desks and paper stacks. The same members who once rolled their eyes at her now sat very still, calculating what it meant to be on the wrong side of that moment. The chairman forced the gavel down, his last attempt at control. "Order," he said, his voice cracking. The gavel struck wood, but it couldn't drown out what already happened, a truth spoken too clearly to be buried. And outside those doors, the world was already moving. Screens lit up, headlines drafted themselves, and Jasmine Crockett's words began to travel. Faster than any donation, louder than any press release. But her next move? It didn't just offend her. It flipped the entire script. The room was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't rest. It waits. Every camera light burned steady red. Every phone was raised, trembling with anticipation. Jasmine Crockett could feel the moment stretching, the heat of 100 gazes pressing toward her. The man across the table smirked again, that polished DC smirk of someone who believed the game was his to control. And then she spoke. "You want to talk about support?" she said, her voice steady, unhurried. "Let's talk about what that really means." The smirk faltered. "You say I should be grateful for donors who write checks like they're writing commandments," she continued. "But tell me, when did democracy become a pay-to-play event? When did truth start needing a sponsor?" A few heads turned. Cameras zoomed in. The clip had already begun to loop in someone's live stream. Her voice, her gaze, her poise. She glanced at the paper in front of her, then back up. $15,000, she said, drawing out the number like it was a verdict. "That's what you think silence costs? That's less than your campaign dinner tab. Less than a lobbyist spends on wine, while they rewrite people's lives. A ripple of gasps shot through the room. Staffers look at one another, eyes wide, unsure whether to stay still or start packing their resumes. Jasmine leaned in again, her tone sharpening without rising. "You think you're offering me a favor," she said. "What you're really offering is proof. Proof that power here doesn't want truth. It wants obedience dressed as diplomacy." The chairman's hand twitched on the gavel, but he didn't bring it down. The air had turned electric, and even he knew better than to interrupt history mid-sentence. "Every time someone like me speaks up," she continued, "you try to turn courage into a liability. You call it being uncivil, too loud, too emotional. But let's be real, what you fear is in volume. It's visibility." A collective murmur swept through the back of the room. Journalists, aides, junior staffers whose entire careers have been built on silence, now watching it crumble in real time. Jasmine's voice softened, but the words cut deeper. "I didn't come from money. I came from people who work 2 jobs and still get told they're lazy. From mothers who read eviction notices under flickering streetlights. From neighborhoods you visit once every 4 years, just long enough to make promises you'll never keep." Her eyes locked onto the committee chair. "You think your $15,000 buys silence? My people's struggle is worth more than your comfort. Their dignity isn't for sale. And neither am I." The tension broke, not into chaos, but into energy. Someone in the audience clapped, then another. The chairman tried to gavel it down, but the sound was swallowed by a wave of applause that grew louder, bolder, unstoppable. Back inside, the camera found the official who'd made the offer. His jaw tightened. Sweat glistened on his temple. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Congresswoman," he stammered, "let's not turn this into—" She interrupted, not with aggression, but precision. "Turn this into what? Accountability? Transparency? Maybe you're just not used to women, especially black women, refusing to play by your rules." His face froze, the kind of expression people wear when they realize the cameras have caught too much. A reporter near the back whispered, "That's the clip. That's the clip." Jasmine exhaled, sat back, and folded her hands. The moment didn't need fireworks. It already was won. "For years," she said, quieter now but still firm, "you've told us to wait our turn, to be patient, to be polite. But every second we wait, someone else loses their job, their home, their hope. So if my voice sounds too loud for you, maybe it's because you spent too long turning down the volume on the truth." The audience erupted again, clapping, shouting, cheering her name. The gavel struck wood, but this time it sounded desperate, not decisive. The chairman muttered something about decorum, but no one was listening. On screens across the country, people leaned in closer. Immigrants, activists, working parents, students, all seeing a piece of themselves in her defiance. For once, the hero wasn't scripted, and the system wasn't winning. In slow motion, the camera caught everything the establishment tried to hide. The rolled eyes, the clenched jaws, the polite panic of privilege exposed. Jasmine's words echoed long after the sound faded. "You can't buy silence," she said again, this time more softly, almost to herself. "You can only fear what it exposes." The moment hung there, suspended, history mid-breath. Outside the hearing room, journalists rushed to get statements. Aides whispered, "She's trending worldwide." On one screen, a commentator shook his head and said, "I've covered politics for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Back in the chamber, Jasmine gathered her notes, calm and unshaken. The cameras stayed on her, a woman walking to the ruins of pretense, not triumphant but certain. As she reached the door, a reporter shouted, "Congresswoman Crockett, what's next?" She paused, turned slightly, and gave a small, knowing smile. "Next," she said, "maybe it's time truth stopped knocking and started kicking doors down." The flashes burst like lightning. Her silhouette framed in the glare, shoulders squared, head high. And just like that, the image went viral, a symbol of defiance, of principle, of fire. But what happened in the hours after her speech would shock even her most loyal supporters. The internet didn't just react. It erupted. By midnight, the clip had spread from political corners of Twitter to TikTok edits with dramatic bass drops and neon subtitles. That's less than your campaign dinner tab. One video cut between Jasmine's line and a cash register sound effect. Another turned her speech into a remix that pulsed through headphones in gyms, classrooms, and protest marches. Within hours, hashtag Crockett Clapback was a top global trend. Cable news scrambled to catch up. CNN called it a moment of moral clarity. Fox called it an emotional outburst. MSNBC just replayed the line on loop, the anchor smiling faintly after every repetition. Influencers stitched her clip with tearful commentary. A Latina activist whispered to her followers, "This is what representation looks like." A young black lawyer posted, "I didn't know how much I needed to see this." Even comedians joined in. Late-night hosts built monologues around the moment, turning the $15,000 into a punchline and Jasmine into a cultural icon. One segment opened with her standing tall, mic in hand, as the audience roared. "You can't put a price tag on the truth," she said, and then the host leaned forward, grinning. Turns out, some people in Washington just learned what a refund feels like. Laughter, applause, but beneath it all, a new kind of reverence. News panels debated the fallout. Commentators argued whether she'd gone too far or finally far enough. Conservative pundits rolled their eyes, while progressives turned her words into rally cries. Someone printed the quote on T-shirts. Another launched a GoFundMe for truth-tellers in politics. The dueling narrative spread like wildfire in one corner. Think pieces praising her courage, calling it the kind of spine democracy forgot it needed. In the other, political insiders spinning damage control, insisting the offer was misinterpreted, that it was routine outreach. But the public wasn't buying it. The more they tried to explain, the guiltier they looked. Every denial felt like an admission. The algorithms loved it. Engagement spiked. Thousands of comments poured in every minute. She didn't just win the argument. She rewrote the rules. She spoke for us. She just did what we've all wanted to do. Tell them we're not for sale. For a moment, the divide between politics and people blurred. Ordinary citizens, exhausted teachers, delivery drivers, nurses on overnight shifts, played the clip on their phones during breaks. It wasn't just entertainment. It was validation. It was someone punching through the polished surface of power and saying, "We see you." In coffee shops, the conversation shifted. "Did you hear what she said?" She really called them out. 15,000. That's what they think our silence costs. Hashtags turned into movements. Hashtag Truth Over Power became a rallying cry. Digital artists made illustrations of Jasmine standing at the mic, her expression fierce, her words etched in bold red. Edits layered her speech with footage of civil rights marches, immigrant protests, women raising their fists. It wasn't just political, it was emotional, generational. Meanwhile, the establishment tried to regain control. Anonymous sources whispered to journalists about disciplinary reviews and ethical inquiries. A few colleagues distanced themselves, their statements polished and vague. While we respect her passion, the classic preamble to betrayal. But every attempt to discredit her only amplified her authenticity. One reporter tweeted, "I've covered scandals, speeches, and political stunts. But this was something different. This was personal." The next morning, Jasmine woke to chaos. Her phone vibrating nonstop, notifications stacked like cards. Messages from strangers flooded in. "You gave me hope. My daughter wants to be you. Thank you for not backing down." And in the middle of it all, one message stood out, a photo from a classroom in Detroit. Kids gathered around a projector, watching her clip with wide eyes. The caption read, "We paused our civics lesson today because this is history in real time." The moment had grown beyond her. It was no longer about a committee room or a scandal. It was about ownership, who gets to define truth and who finally gets to speak it. Jasmine stood by her window, watching the city come alive under the rising sun. Somewhere, people were cheering her name. Somewhere else, men in suits were plotting their next move. But in that quiet moment, she wasn't thinking about virality or fame. Because for Jasmine, it was never about going viral. It was about something deeper. The storm had passed. but the air still hummed with energy, that rare stillness after a nation exhales. Jasmine stood at the edge of the Capitol steps, reporters shouting questions that dissolved into the crisp evening wind. For once, she didn't answer. She just looked out the horizon, the flag rippling above her, the streets stretching toward neighborhoods that looked nothing like these marble halls. In the echo of it all, she thought about where she came from. Long days in courtrooms that smelled of fear and frustration, clients who paid in gratitude because they couldn't afford more. She remembered her mother's hands, calloused from work, teaching her that worth isn't measured in what you have, but in what you refuse to compromise. When the cameras finally caught her face again, it wasn't fire they saw. It was grace. When they try to buy your silence, she began softly, that's when your voice matters most. The words didn't roar, they resonated. They carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen the cost of compliance and decided to pay a different price. They thought a check could make me forget who sent me here. But I wasn't elected to whisper. I was elected to speak. Her speech rippled across timelines, through newsrooms, into living rooms where people pause mid-dinner just to listen. Every generation, she continued, has its test. Some face wars, some face injustice, some face a temptation to settle. But dignity, real dignity, isn't something you can purchase, threaten, or spin. It's what you carry when the lights turn off and nobody's clapping. The crowd below was silent, hanging on every word. She looked down at them, workers, students, parents, the people she'd been fighting for long before a camera ever found her. I didn't turn down $15,000, she said. I turned down the idea that truth is negotiable, because if we sell that, we sell the very thing that makes this country worth fighting for. Her tone shifted, softer now, like she was speaking directly to whoever had ever been told to stay quiet. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe they told you to wait your turn, to play it safe, to keep your head down. But let me tell you, change never comes from silence. It comes from the courage to be loud when it costs you the most. Applause began to spread, not a roar but a wave, building, connecting strangers through something shared and simple, pride. Jasmine smiled faintly, the kind that carries both exhaustion and triumph. Power without principle is nothing, she said. But principle can outlast any headline, any offer, any threat. Because dignity isn't for sale. Not at 15,000, not at 15 million. Not ever. For a moment, the sound of clapping drowned everything. The street noise, the murmurs, even the distant city hum. It wasn't just applause for her. It was for every person who'd been told they were too loud, too bold, too much. It was for those who refused to be bought. As the sun slipped behind the Capitol dome, the golden light caught her face, not as a spotlight, but as affirmation. Because in that instant, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman who said no to corruption. She was a mirror, reflecting back what people wanted to believe still existed in their country. Courage, conscience, and the unshakable belief that truth still matters. But Jasmine had one final message, not for her enemies, but for every viewer watching at home. They tried to shut her down with $15,000. But all they did was make her voice louder. The headlines have faded. The hashtags have cooled. But the echo of that moment still lingers. A reminder that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can shake the biggest rooms. Jasmine Crockett didn't just reject a bribe. She rewrote the price of integrity in an age that keeps trying to auction it off. Her voice became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of remembrance, of what it means to hold your ground when the world expects your silence. She didn't have the most money, the most power, or the loudest platform. What she had was conviction, and that was enough to make the system blink. So if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to stay quiet, remember Jasmine Crockett. Speak anyway. Speak, because your voice might be the one that breaks the pattern, the one that reminds others they're not alone. Because truth doesn't whisper. It resists. It survives. And when spoken with courage, it multiplies. Share this if you believe truth can be bought. Subscribe for more stories of those who fight back. Because the next voice that refuses to be silenced might just be yours.